There are works of art, works of portraiture, which possess such richness of detail, such individuality and depth of character, that they convey a sense of immediate human presence to us, no matter how remote in time their subjects might be from us. These portraits are from the Portugal of 600 years ago. Yet, as we gaze at them, and they at us, we feel that we might hear breath drawn, or the rustle of robes, or glimpse the turning of a head, or the stirring of a hand. It is as if, at any moment, one of them might cross the distance of centuries, meet our gaze, and speak to us. These are the Saint Vincent Panels, one of the greatest of Portuguese and European artistic treasures, today preserved and exhibited in Lisbon. The panels were painted in the latter part of the 15th century, perhaps in the 1460s or early 1470s. They are attributed to the painter Nuno Gonçalves, court painter to King Afonso V, and the foremost painter of the Flemish style in late medieval and early Renaissance Portugal. Gonçalves is universally regarded as one of the greatest of Portuguese artists, a master painter of European stature, but he remains an obscure figure. We do not know what he looked like. This imaginative and heroicized depiction is from the mid-20th century Monument to the Discoveries in Lisbon. We do not know when or where he was born, and all we know of his death is that it had happened by 1492. Gonçalves may have trained in the Low Countries, which had important artistic connections with Portugal in the 15th century, and it is possible that he visited Italy as well. Only a handful of works attributed to Gonçalves survive today, of which the Saint Vincent Panels are the most significant. This work of art consists of 6 oak panels, 4 narrow and 2 wide, all just over 2 meters or 6 feet in height. Each of the 4 narrow panels is about 60 centimeters or 2 feet wide, while the 2 wider panels are slightly over twice that width. The whole assemblage, as currently displayed, and it has not always been shown as a single set of panels, is thus roughly 2 meters or 6 feet high and 5 meters or 16 feet wide. On these wooden panels are painted in oils 60 human figures, close to life size, 57 men and 2 women. That makes 59, because one figure is repeated twice. In each case, he is the central figure in one of the larger panels. He is normally identified as Saint Vincent of Zaragoza, a martyr of the early church and patron saint of the city of Lisbon. The others represent a great range of contemporary society, from royalty and nobility through clergy and wealthy laymen to soldiers and fishermen. The figures are beautifully painted, and each face is clearly an individual portrait. But the identification of the figures, while much study and energy has been put into it over the years, is plagued with uncertainty. The work has been called by several different names. It has most commonly been known as the Saint Vincent Panels, in Portuguese Painéis de São Vicente, based on the identification of that central twice-repeated figure as Saint Vincent. The work is also commonly called the Saint Vincent altarpiece, because of the idea that it might be an altarpiece or a part of one. It has also been called the Panels or Altarpiece of Saint Vincent de Fora, after the monastery in Lisbon where the panels were rediscovered in 1882, beginning their modern history. In 1548, the Portuguese humanist Francisco de Holanda referred in his treatise Da Pintura Antiga, of ancient painting, to an altarpiece he had seen in Lisbon Cathedral depicting St. Vincent, painted about 100 years earlier by an artist he described as one of the great masters of the age, Nuno Gonçalves. This altarpiece was replaced in the early 18th century by one in the newly fashionable Baroque style. The old altarpiece was stored away in the cathedral until 1742, and was then taken to the Archbishop's palace in the village of Mitra, just outside Lisbon. On 1st November 1755, Lisbon was struck by a hugely destructive earthquake and fire which left much of the city in ruins. The new altarpiece was lost when the cathedral was largely reduced to rubble, but its predecessor, the work by Nuno Gonçalves, was safe in the palace at Mitra and escaped the destruction. But nothing was heard of this work subsequently for over a century. In 1882, 6 painted wooden panels were discovered in storage in the monastery of Saint Vincent in Lisbon. They attracted great interest from art historians, and in 1910 they were attributed to Nuno Gonçalves on the basis of style and the apparent presence of a signature by the Lisbon art historian and curator Dr. José de Figueiredo. He also identified them with the lost altarpiece of St. Vincent, which Gonçalves had created for the cathedral, which had been stored at Mitra and had then apparently vanished. Those claims are still broadly accepted today, although almost everything about the panels, their origin, authorship, purpose, history, and meaning, remains uncertain and open to challenge and reinterpretation. The panels remain an enigma. Studies carried out in the 1990s of the 6 oak panels making up the work revealed traces of extensive preparatory drawings, and it is unsurprising that such a complex composition, bringing together so many figures, required careful planning. Every panel radiates artistic richness. The many highly individual faces, the deep colours, the shimmering fabrics and shining metalwork, and the superbly rendered details create a dazzling and unforgettable impression. The names by which the panels are most generally known today are the panel of the friars, the panel of the fishermen, the panel of the prince, the panel of the archbishop, the panel of the knights, and the panel of the relic. When rediscovered, the panels were arranged in 2 groups of 3, making 2 triptychs, each with a panel showing the figure identified as St. Vincent in the centre, and in the early and mid-20th century they were exhibited in this way. It is unusual that the figure of the central saint of the work, St. Vincent, is shown twice, although this difficulty disappears if we are in fact looking at 2 triptychs, whether intended to be displayed together or for 2 separate settings. In any case, today they are displayed as one continuous frieze-like piece, a reconstruction based on the perspective treatment of the tiles on the floor. This remains another element of uncertainty in our understanding of this enigmatic work of art. The wood of the panels has been reliably dated to the mid-15th century. Research by Dr. Peter Klein of the University of Hamburg confirmed in 2001 that the trees which provided the oak used in the panels were cut down around 1445, while in the painting itself the style of armour, weaponry, and dress is broadly consistent with the latter half of the 15th century, with some apparently deliberately archaic exceptions for people who were no longer alive when the panels were painted, who were dressed in the styles of their lifetime. This period was a crucial one in Portugal's history, the era of the discoveries, which saw Portuguese seafarers transform European connections with and understandings of the wider world. The people depicted on the panels are varied and distinctive, but each is sombre, grave, watchful, withdrawn. There is a remoteness to these portraits, despite the immediacy of their presence and the realism with which they are depicted. The Portuguese writer José Saramago, who believed the panels to be among the most beautiful pictures in the world, wrote in 1990 that they show every feature of what makes up our Portuguese character. He saw the portraits of the ordinary people in particular as so powerful they cannot be diminished by the greater emphasis placed on the figures of kings, nobles, and clerics in front of them. It is not hard, he observed, to match these faces with contemporary ones. Yet he reflected too on their remoteness and the fact that they represent a society which is no longer accessible to us, even to the Portuguese of modern Portugal, inheritors of the history of which these people are the makers. At a certain point in our history, we Portuguese lost the ability to recognize ourselves in the mirror these panels offer us. For Saramago, the panels were not merely a work of art. They were witnesses to a history that he believed the Portuguese themselves had willfully lost touch with. He saw them as a touchstone of Portuguese identity. José de Figueiredo had made the same argument in his pioneering 1910 study of the panels, placing them at the heart of Portuguese identity and holding them up as an inspirational example of the continuity of that identity. Fishermen of the south, with their caps almost Levantine in style, seafarers of the north, with their characteristic hoods and typical woolen gabardine, appear before us, shoulder to shoulder, with the rugged men-at-arms and with the clergy and the monks, within a hand's reach of kings and princes. And all of society is drawn together in the same impulse, in the adoration of the saint, their patron, strongly united in the same way as they were some decades earlier, when the old and powerful Lion of Castile made his attempt upon them. This latter point is a reference to the Castilian invasion of 1385, which was defeated at the Battle of Aljubarrota by João of Aviz, who became King João I and founder of the royal dynasty of Aviz, which is celebrated in these panels. In the early 20th century, a time of revolutionary turmoil and political instability in Portugal, the panels brought a reassuring message of continuity, stability, and unity. This was adopted very readily by the authoritarian Estado Novo under the dictator Dr. Antonio de Oliveira Salazar. As we mentioned at the beginning, Nuno Gonçalves is prominently featured among the figures on the monument to the discoveries in Lisbon, originated in 1940 and completed in its present form in 1960. During these years, the panels had a particular significance as symbols of the distinctive character of Portugal and of Portuguese greatness, artistic greatness, but also the national greatness of the era of the discoveries. That link is made explicitly, for example, in this 1939 article from the Bulletin of the Mocidade Portuguesa Feminina, the youth organization for girls in Salazar's Portugal, which reports on a visit to the museum in Lisbon where the panels were then displayed. The writer calls the panels a great lesson in history and art, which gripped the attention of the visitors. The accompanying photograph shows the girls in their uniforms gazing earnestly at the three panels making up the first triptych. It was even claimed that the face of one of the figures in the panels was, miraculously, the exact likeness of Dr. Salazar himself. This was the cover story in the illustrated supplement of Diario de Noticias for Christmas 1932, the year in which Salazar had become Prime Minister. If the panels were indeed a mirror for the nation, then, under the dictatorship, the face they reflected was Salazar's. There are many theories as to who is represented on the panels. The Portuguese newspaper Público, in a recent investigation of the history and historiography of the panels, lists on the project's website 39 different scholars and others who, since 1895, have put names to at least some of the figures. In the centre, we have the two figures commonly identified as Saint Vincent. Then there are 8 candidates for Dom Pedro, Duke of Coimbra, who was regent during the minority of King Afonso V, and who was defeated by Afonso in a civil war over the rightful claim to the throne in 1449. There are 4 figures potentially representing Henry the Navigator, 5 possible figures of Dom Fernando, the Holy Prince, who died in captivity in Morocco, 3 individuals who could be King Afonso V, 5 possible representations of Dom Afonso, 1st Duke of Braganza, and 6 possible figures of King Duarte I, father of Afonso V. It's clear, then, that the identity of the people in the panels is open to much interpretation and conjecture, with many being subject to multiple identifications. The two figures of St. Vincent lack the attributes normally associated with that saint, which include the rack, the millstone, and the raven. He has, instead, a piece of rope on the ground in front of him in the panel of the Archbishop, which may be a reference to aspects of his martyrdom, but its significance remains unclear. He does appropriately wear the elaborate robes of a deacon. Other identifications have been proposed for the St. Vincent figure, including St. John the Evangelist and St. Catherine, but the most popular alternative explanation is that he is Prince Fernando, the Holy Prince who died in Moorish captivity after Portugal's failed campaign to take Tangier. This casts the whole work into an alternative explanatory framework, in which it is concerned not with the success of Portuguese exploration and expansion, but with the failure of Portugal's campaigns in North Africa, giving the panels a penitential rather than a celebratory purpose. Whoever he is, in the panel of the Archbishop he is surrounded by soldiers, as if blessing them before battle, while in the background stand senior churchmen, including, in his robes and mitre, the Archbishop for whom the panel is named, Jorge da Costa, Archbishop of Lisbon from 1464 to 1500. In the panel of the Prince he is surrounded by members of the Portuguese royal house. Kneeling in front of him is a figure in rich green brocade, with his hand on his sword, usually taken to be King Afonso V, who reigned from 1438 to 1481, with a brief abdication in 1477. Behind him is a child, a young boy, convincingly identified as his son, Prince João, later King João II. He was often remarked for his pale skin, which is clearly depicted here. Behind him is perhaps the best-known portrait from the panels, conventionally taken to be that of the Infante Enrique, best known in English as Prince Henry the Navigator, the patron of the discoveries, again a widely accepted identification, but not certain. The portrait resembles closely a portrait in a manuscript from 1453, Chronicas dos Feitos de Guiné, the Chronicle of Discovery and Conquest of Guinea, by Gomes Yanes de Zurara, but doubt has also been cast on whether this portrait is Henry. It may itself have been based on the one in the St. Vincent Panels, simply perpetuating the misidentification, or it may be a portrait of his brother, King Duarte I, or of Pedro, the regent. In that case, presumably the figure on the panel is Prince Pedro as well, although other figures have traditionally been identified as Pedro. There is another candidate for Henry the Navigator in this work, on the panel of the Knights, which we will come to in a minute. On the left are the only two women in the panels. In the foreground, Alfonso's wife, Queen Consort of Portugal, Isabella of Coimbra. She is shown as a young woman in her 20s. She died at the age of 23 in 1455. Various attempts have been made to identify the older woman in the religious habit, most often identifying her as the widow of Prince Pedro, although she has also been associated with other royal and noble women of that generation. But if the figure usually taken to be a portrait of Henry the Navigator is in fact King Duarte I, the woman opposite him might be expected to be his queen. That would make the older woman Leonor of Aragon, and this panel a commemoration of 3 generations of the royal family. Of the figures in the uppermost row, a mixture of clerics and laymen, none has been satisfactorily identified. It has been suggested by José de Figueiredo and others that the leftmost figure is a self-portrait of Nuno Gonçalves, with next to him his artist brother and possible collaborator João. He looks out of the picture with an assertive gaze, as if challenging the onlooker with the magnitude of his achievement. The panel of the friars, or monks, has as its most prominent figures 3 kneeling monks in the white robes of the Cistercian order, presumably from the monastery of Alcobaza, north of Lisbon, one of the oldest and most important monastic foundations in Portugal, and one with deep links to the Portuguese royal house. Behind them are three more figures, not in clerical habits. The man on the left looks as if he has a monastic tonsure, but is in fact wearing a leather cap of a flesh colour. He is also carrying something in his hand, an object covered in a green cloth. This may be a holy relic, perhaps related to Saint Vincent, but it is impossible to be certain. As with all the figures on the panels, the faces are clearly individual portraits. The prominent bearded man on the right has given rise to much speculation that he is a Byzantine cleric, or the Infante Fernando, or a court physician, or Nebuchadnezzar, or just a monk with a beard. The matter is unresolved. The panel of the fishermen contains 7 figures. In the foreground is a bearded figure in a brown robe, bent over on all fours, seemingly in prayer or penitence, with a rosary in his hands. He may be a monk or other religious figure, but he has also been interpreted as simply a fisherman in a brown cloak. His rosary is made of fish vertebrae. The 2 central figures are swathed in a fishing net, with its wooden floats clearly visible along the top line. The one in the foreground, closest to the clasped hands of the man in green, has sometimes been misidentified as a compass or other navigational instrument, but it is simply a disc-shaped wooden float. The net continues behind them to wrap around one of the 4 men in the background, the one who supposedly resembles Dr. Salazar. Perhaps there is something about these 3 men that sets them apart from the others. Senior figures in some fishing brotherhood, possibly. Whatever the explanation, the figures on this panel can be said to be held together by their connection with the sea, a potent theme for the great age of the discoveries. In the panel of the knights, a group of 4 clerics, whose identities are now lost to us, overlook 4 figures in armour. At the front, kneeling in prayer, and with his equipment showing signs of use and damage, is a figure sometimes identified, as we have heard, as Henry the Navigator, but also named as Afonso, 1st Duke of Braganza, or Fernando, 2nd Duke of Braganza, or other leading figures of the Portuguese court. The other knights have equally contested identities, including the dark figure in the shining helmet, who looks in a different direction to the others. He has been seen as Don Fernando, the Holy Prince, or perhaps a Moorish soldier. This panel may be concerned with the failed campaign in Tangier, or with the celebration of the discoveries and of Portuguese expansion. The panel of the relic contains 5 figures, 2 senior religious personages, a man in distinctive clothing holding an open book, an elderly and tired-looking pilgrim with a staff standing in front of an odd wooden construction which has never been satisfactorily explained, and a large man in red who holds the object which gives the panel its name. He has been identified with various leading figures in the Portuguese court or church, but it seems most likely, to judge from his red clothing, that he is a representative of the City Council of Lisbon, whose members wore bright crimson robes at important events and festivities. The object he holds with such reverence has been identified as a fragment of skull, clearly a holy relic, presumably of Saint Vincent. Behind him is a figure in dark clothing with a red symbol on his chest, holding a book with illegible characters, perhaps intended to suggest Hebrew. As a result, he has been identified as a Jew, perhaps a leading rabbi of Lisbon, or a Jew at the court, protected by his privileged status and serving as a physician, astrologer, philosopher, or official overseeing the royal finances. Those Jews whose presence was tolerated in 15th century Portugal wore a star to identify themselves, and the suggestion is that the symbol he wears is such a star. This theory is not unchallenged, however. Others have seen him as a dignitary of the Christian Church, an ambassador, or a chronicler. Like the other figures on the panels, he is, in the end, a mystery. The Saint Vincent Panels make up a uniquely important work in Portuguese art history, and from the late 19th century they have played an important role in questions of Portuguese identity. For 150 years the panels have been intensively examined and written about, but we still know almost nothing about them with any certainty. They constitute a very enigmatic and very enthralling, as well as a very beautiful work of art. At the time the St. Vincent Panels were created, Portugal was already an old established state, around 300 years old, a small country on the western margins of Europe. But it had achieved its reconquest and defined its borders, had repelled foreign invasion and overcome internal division, and had consolidated itself as a feudal state of king and church, but also a state that looked outward and embraced the open oceans, a state of soldiering, salvation, and the sea. The Portugal of the discoveries is represented here, simultaneously at the edge of Europe and at the center of the world.